Okay, so this is going to be a short video. In this video, I'm mostly going to focus, or only going to focus, on describing what a moderator is. So a moderator, in terms of a bivariate correlation, so keep that in mind. So when we're dealing with two variables, a bivariate correlation, a moderator is a variable that changes that relationship between the two variables. So in the diagram you see on top, you have an IV, an independent variable, and we're trying to see how is that IV related to that DV. Now, in terms of a bivariate correlation, it might confuse you to think about it in terms of an IV, right? Just because we're not claiming one is causing the other. So let's just think about two factors, two variables, right? There's a relationship there. And then we have a moderator, another variable that influences the relationship between the IV and the DV. On the bottom, you have an example of a third variable. Now, a third variable is actually something you don't want, right? A third variable gets in the way of our internal validity because we're trying to claim there's some kind of causal relationship or even just some relationship between both variables, but then there's some other third variable that actually explains that relationship. A moderator is different. A moderator, we actually accounted for in our design, and we're saying, yes, there's a relationship between our two variables, but it depends on this second variable. Now, going to the next slide, here's some examples that I'll walk you through. So here you have some text. Let me check and see if I want to explain any of this. Okay, so I'm actually already planning on explaining this, so I won't read through this. You could go ahead and pause the frame and take a look at this, but mostly I want to show you the points I'm making here in this text using the examples on the right. Okay, so let's say you have a study that's looking at the relationship between caffeine and anxiety. Let's say that you have a correlation there, a bivariate correlation, meaning that people who report drinking more caffeine tend to be more anxious in your bivariate correlation. It looks like there's a relationship there. You're not claiming a causal relationship. But let's look at that first table, right? The one on top. So you have gender on the left, and you have decaf, or the caffeine situation, on top, and the measures of anxiety are the actual numbers. Okay, so when you break it down this way, we look at people who drink decaf coffee versus people who drink caffeinated coffee, and we are looking at gender, and we see that for male participants who drink decaf. Now, keep in mind, you're not assigning them to drink decaf. They already drink decaf in real life. They just report back to you that they drink decaf. They differ from the participants who drink normal coffee, right? The male participants. There's a difference for the male participants. But for the female participants, it looks like there is no difference. The decaf and caffeine participants, in terms of their anxiety, the female participants are pretty similar in terms of their anxiety level, 60 and 63. So these are hypothetical situations, hypothetical data, right? So let's look at the next one, right? So it looks like here in this situation, for the male participants, the decaf participants let me explain this another way. The participants who report drinking caffeine are more anxious than the ones that report not drinking caffeine for the male participants. But for the female participants, now you're not likely to find this with caffeine, but for some reason, they're reporting a lower anxiety level. Now, these are both not interactions. These are both moderating variables or situations where gender is a moderating variable. It's moderating the relationship between caffeine and anxiety. Or in other words, the relationship between caffeine and anxiety depends on gender. Now, you kind of heard me slip up and say interaction. This is actually an interaction. But we go over interactions later on in between chapter 11 and 12, maybe 10. But for now, think of it as a moderating variable. There is a relationship between caffeine and anxiety, but that relationship depends on this other variable, that other variable being gender. Now, if you had a situation like that bottom table, where the male participants who had decaf had an anxiety level of 60 versus the male participants who had caffeine reporting 65, and then it happens to be the same exact thing for female participants. For the female participants, they also have 60 and 65, right? Then gender is not a moderating variable, right? That relationship between caffeine and anxiety is the same regardless of gender. So it's that other variable is not moderating the relationship between caffeine and anxiety. So keep that in mind. Moderator variable is when that relationship between your two variables, it depends on this other variable. In the example I gave you, it was gender. A third variable, or a confound variable, similar, same thing. A third variable issue challenges internal validity, and it's a variable you did not take into account when studying whatever it is you're studying in your study design. You didn't take it into account, and it might provide an alternate explanation for what you're actually claiming, right? So you do not want a third variable, but moderators are okay. They help explain in more detail that relationship between both of your variables. All right, so let me know if you have any questions.